We'll make a new tomorrow. Talk to me. We'll make this happy face. Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make this happy face.
All right. Wow. Sorry about that. Starting right off with the frog in my throat. All right, so we are on chapter 14 of Crosscurrent. There are 15 chapters, so we're 84% through the book, according to the Kindle app here. So let's just jump straight on into it and see how far we get. Jaden felt the weight of his solitude the moment he and Kedron parted. He was surprised at how much he had come to rely on the presence of Junker's crew. He had isolated himself for so long that he had forgotten the value of simple companionship. They were good men, Kedron and Mar. Rascals, yes, but quality rascals. He moved as rapidly as he could through the facility. The beam of a glow rod and the glow of his lightsaber augmented the dim illumination from the emergency lights. He did not need to consult the folded schematic in his pocket to know the direction of the lift. The way there was engraved in his brain. Without Kedron at his side, the metal walls of the narrow corridors felt increasingly oppressive. Their unbroken gray smoothness, a winter sky that sunlight never pierced. He wondered how the Imperial scientists had remained here for any length of time without going mad. Perhaps they hadn't, he thought, recalling the progressively deteriorating physical condition of Dr. Black in the hololog, Dr. Gray's nervous hand spasm. His exhalations steamed in the cool air. The echo of his boots on the floor seemed to carry everywhere, and somewhere in the complex, at the base of the communications tower, the facility sent its heartbeat pulsing into space. Help us. Help us. He swallowed and ran a hand through his hair, taking a moment to gather himself. He was not fearful of encountering the clones, if any yet survived. Like all Jedi, he did not fear battle or death, but he was growing ever more fearful of encountering an answer to his question, and he felt certain the lift would take him to it. Static crackled over the open comlink connection he maintained with Kedron. Something in the facility's makeup must have interfered with short-range communication. Between bursts of static, he heard Kedron's breathing, an occasional whispered curse, the thump of Kedron's boots on the floor as he made his way back to the ship. The sounds reminded Jaden that he was not alone, that he was still connected. Everything all right? He said in response to another of Kedron's curses. Static roared in to fill the silence after he'd spoken. Fine, Kedron said, his voice a whisper as if he feared to awaken whatever slept in the facility. I'm tripping over debris is all. This glow rod isn't exactly a... Static ate the rest of his reply. Let me know when you get to the ship, Jaden said. Will do, Kedron said through the interference. Serenaded by even more static, Jaden continued through the facility. Doors and side passages opened here and there. He caught a glimpse of a kitchen that smelled faintly of food rotted long ago. Another recreation room with rusted exercise equipment, conference rooms, all of the mundane trappings of a research facility anywhere in the galaxy. Except for the blaster marks that scored the walls and ceilings, the black lines of cryptic script that chronicled the death of the facility. Ahead, at the end of the long corridor, he saw the closed double doors of the lift, blackened and scarred by by a barrage of blaster fire. A headless body lay on the ground near the lift doors, half propped against the wall, the arms thrown out wide as if to embrace. He noted the lab coat. Segments of stormtrooper armor containing bits of desiccated body parts littered the corridor between Jaden and the lift. Large pieces of security droids lay strewn about the hall, likewise dismembered. Here a leg, there a torso, there a head, the eyes gone dark. Jaden recognized the work of a lightsaber, and a skilled combatant at that. Guilt dogged Kedron's steps. He knew Jaden was right. Kedron would be no help facing any of the clones, should any have survived, but he still felt as if he was abandoning the Jedi. For all Jaden's power, all his talent, he still struck Kedron as remarkably fragile and entirely alone. And for all Kedron's cynicism, he liked Jaden. Because I run, Kedron murmured, embarrassed to have ever uttered the words, notwithstanding their truth. He wished that he understood himself less well, that he could live in ignorance of his character flaws. He felt himself a coward. Yet his fear was warranted. He had gotten in much deeper than he had intended, and whatever had happened in the facility was better left undisturbed. He no longer felt like he was walking through a research facility. Instead, he felt like he was walking through the scene of a mass murder. Sweat soaked his clothes under his envirosuit. His fingers girdled the handle of his blaster too tightly, and he consciously relaxed them. He soft-stepped his way back through the complex, trying even to quiet his breathing, hyper-aware of his surroundings. The hololog had unnerved him. He had seen the concern root in the eyes of the doctors, seen the root blossom into fear. If the Force had led Mar to choose a course that brought him to the moon, then the Force could, carking well, curl up in a corner and die. Okay? Kedron wanted nothing more than to be off the moon, back aboard Junker, drinking pulque. Mar had turned some corner around which Kedron could not see. He'd given up Kedron's skewed view of the galaxy for the straightforward view of the Jedi. He had seemed eager to fly with Relin. Eager. Kedron worried for Mar, and despite himself, he worried for Jaden. I do not quit, Jedi, he had said those words. They sounded like self-mockery, like a bad joke. He did quit. He was quitting. Unbidden, Relin's words bubbled up from the soup of his memory. The Jedi, Wan Haggard, the Walking Dead. You cannot always run, Kedron. But he always had. Not so much from fear of danger as from fear of standing still. He cursed under his breath as he walked, each stride punctuated with a soft expletive. The guilt did not relent, and he could not believe what he had come to. He was seriously considering turning around to stand next to a Jedi he'd only just met and possibly face foes against which he could do nothing. Maybe he had turned a corner too. And maybe he'd stared out too many viewports while moving through hyperspace and gotten the madness. The comlink blurted static, putting his already racing heart in the back of his throat. Stang, he hissed, his steps already starting to slow. He was still moving in the same direction, but only by way of inertia, not propulsion. Time to change course. Back to Jaden. Jaden studied the scene, imagining the battle in his head. Security droids, backed by a squad of stormtroopers, had been waiting when the clones came up the lift. Blaster fire and smoke had filled the hall. The clones, deflecting the shots with their lightsabers, had cut their way through both men and machines. When all had gone quiet, one of the medical corps' doctors had approached the clones, perhaps pleading for mercy or arguing for reason and calm. They had decapitated her. He suspected no staff had escaped the facility, and for the first time he seriously considered the possibility that no clones remained on the moon. That they had taken whatever ships had been available to the staff and fled into the unknown regions. As the dire implications of that settled on him, Jedi Sith clones roaming space, a burst of static exploded from the comlink. He winced as if it were blaster fire. Say again, Kedron? More static. Perhaps they were losing contact altogether. He picked his way through the aftermath of the battle, feeling as if he were walking through a graveyard. The large pieces of the droids, the metallic tombstones. When he reached the doors, he looked down at the corpse. Time had drawn the skin tight over the bones and discolored it to ash. The trousers and lab coat, stuffed with a headless body, struck him as obscene. He read the name on the coat, Dr. Gray. He flashed back to Hololog, the fear he had seen in her eyes when she had recorded the final entry. She had been right to fear. A clone had decapitated her, probably while she stood there unarmed. Jaden stared at the lift doors and flashed back to the airlock door on Centerpoint Station, the frightened eyes staring at him through the tiny viewport. They had been those of someone who, though armed, was not dangerous. He reached for the button to summon the lift, cognizant that the same hand and the same gesture had spaced more than 24 people on Centerpoint. Somewhere behind the walls, a mechanism hummed. The lift still functioned. He stood there awaiting it, living for a moment in his past, in his guilt. The lift arrived, opened. Dr. Gray's head lay in the center. The open eyes on the mummified visage stared holes into his soul. For a moment his feet remained stuck to the floor, pinioned there by Dr. Gray's eyes. Random static from the comlink freed him from his paralysis. "I am heading down," he said to Kedron. He entered the lift, turning his back to Dr. Gray, and watched the doors close. He tapped the button on the control panel for the lower level. The lift began to sink, and Jaden with it. By the time Kedron reached the recreation room and its sabak table, he had resolved to stop. "I'm coming back," he said to Jaden, but feared the static in the connection had disrupted the transmission. On impulse, and without looking at them, he took the cards from the single sabak hand he had left unturned on the table and stuffed them in his pocket. He decided they totaled 23, no matter what they showed. Someone in the facility must have been lucky. His comlink coughed more static, but he caught the tail end of whatever Jaden said. Down. "Say again, Jaden." A voice spoke in his ear, and breath that smelled of rotting meat warmed his neck. He said he was heading down. Kedron whirled, bringing up his blaster. Kel seized the human's wrist and held the arm out wide, while the blaster discharged, putting a smoking hole in the sabak table. Cards fluttered into the air like freed birds. Kel's and Kedron's Dane Nossi whirled around them, and arms of their personal spiral galaxy, or the arms of their personal. Staring into Kedron's misaligned eyes, Kel projected, "Be still." The human showed surprising resistance, swinging an overhand left that caught Kel on the temple. The punch might have knocked a human unconscious, but it only surprised Kel. Frowning, he squeezed Kedron's wrist hard, felt the bones start to crack. Kedron winced with pain, grunting through the wall of his clenched teeth. He tried to twist his cracking wrist free from the vice grip of Kel's grip, but did not have the strength. The human punched Kel in the face once, twice, again. Kel absorbed the blows, his nose trickling blood, and squeezed as hard as he could. The bones of Kedron's wrist snapped at last, and the human shrieked with agony, spraying saliva. Kel did not release his grip, but instead ground the bone shards against one another, the coarse friction and music of pain under the human's flesh. Kedron's scream went on, ending only when Kel took him by the throat with his free hand and lifted him from his feet. The human hung in his arms, clawing with his one good arm at Kel's grip, trying to draw breath, his legs spasming with the effort. Kel watched his Dane Nossi twist around the humans and overwhelm them, strangling Kedron's possible futures just as Kel strangled his body. He looked into Kedron's pain-dazed eyes. "Be still," Kel projected, more forcefully, and Kedron at last went limp. One of the human's eyes focused on Kel, and the other off to the left, perhaps seeing the end approach. Out of habit, Kel opened the slits in his cheeks, and his feeders slipped out. The human, lost in his pain and the maze of Kel's mental command, did not appear to notice them until they began to slide up his nostrils. He kicked feebly and shook his head, fighting against Kel's mental hold. But his struggles proved futile. Kel's feeders knifed their way through the nasal tissue. Kedron's eyes watered. Blood leaked around the feeders, out the human's nostrils, and into his beard and mouth. Only then did, it says Ken, but I think it's supposed to be Kel, realize what he was doing, that he felt nothing, that he was risking revelation by surrendering to his appetite prematurely. The possibility of feeding on the human soup elicited no longing, no yearning expectation of revelation. He looked at Kedron's Dane Nossi, found them uncomplicated entirely, lines of fate that did nothing more than curl back on themselves forever, leading nowhere, offering nothing. Kedron Fall did not offer revelation. No one did, except Jaden Core. Their lines were connected, Kel's and Jaden's. Only Jaden's lines, once enwrapped by Kel's, would map out the road to understanding, would scribe characters of revelation to Kel to read. I don't know why it keeps saying Ken. Only then would Kel have what he had sought for centuries. Disgusted with himself, and with Kedron, he pulled back his feeders. They came clear of Kedron's face with a wet slurping sound. A flood of blood and snot poured from Kedron's nose. Kel lowered Kedron to the floor, loosening his grip on the human's throat. Attempting to draw in some air, Kedron instead aspirated some of the blood and snot and began to cough. When he finished, he looked up into Kel's face. The human's eyes watered. A network of popping blood vessels made a circuit board of his eyes. Blood and mucus slathered his mustache and beard. "What are you?" he asked, his voice as coarse as a rasp. Kel almost answered by reflex, "I am a ghost," but stopped himself. "I am a pilgrim," he said instead. Kedron's face screwed into a question, and Kel, distracted, drove his fist into the center of it. Kedron did not make a sound. His nose shattered, blood sprayed, and Kel let him fall on his back to the floor, unconscious. He gathered up Kedron's blaster, searched him for other weapons, found none, stripped him of his comlink, and left him on the floor. He considered slitting Kedron's throat with his vibroblade, but realized that he was indifferent to Kedron Fall, and he would no longer murder with indifference. Perhaps his apathetic butchery had been the reason revelation so long eluded him. He must kill only with his spirit on fire, and he was burning for Jaden Core. And Jaden had headed down. Kel left Kedron behind and followed after Jaden. His pilgrimage was nearing its end. Kedron swam in pain, drowning, flailing, seeking release. He awoke on the cold floor of the recreation room, coughing blood. Each cough drove a spike of pain through his nose and nasal cavity. The metallic taste of blood clung to the roof of his mouth, near the back of his throat. He winced with remembered pain and terror, recalling the pointed appendages that had squirmed from his attacker's cheeks and wormed up his nose. He'd been unable to breathe, unable to think, violated. Nausea seized him. He sat up, vomited blood, snot, and his last meal onto the deck, where it steamed in the cold. Forgetting the details of his injuries, he steadied himself with a hand on the floor, and his broken wrist screamed in protest. The pain from bone grinding against bone almost caused him to pass out. He held on to consciousness through sheer force of will. After the room stopped spinning, after the pain in his wrist grew bearable, he used a chair from the sabbac table to help him to his feet. His shattered nose did not allow air to pass, so his breath wheezed through his mouth, left hanging open like a cargo bay door. As he rose, he fixed his eyes on a sabbac card that had fallen from the table, staring at the image on it, a grinning clown face in an absurd hat. The idiot. He almost laughed. His body ached from the beating. The adrenaline dump and the after effects of the terror he'd felt left him weak, shaking, barely able to stand. He tried to collect his wits, gather his thoughts, endure the pain in his wrist. Had the creature been one of the clones? It had seemed a Force user. He'd felt it slip into his thoughts and command him to be still. The greasy feeling of being mentally violated had been reminiscent of Jaden's use of the mind trick. Why had it left him alive? He did not know and did not care. It was enough that he was alive. He reached for his comlink, thinking to warn Jaden, and found it gone. The creature had taken it. He looked around the room for his blaster, saw that it, too, was missing. The creature seemed concerned only that Kedron be unarmed and unable. The creature seemed concerned only that unable to warn Jaden. It repeated the sentence. He had no particular interest in Kedron, apparently. Kedron understood the message. Leave and it's all over. He had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. It had seemed exactly so since he had first met Jaden Core. One problem after another, he murmured. Dizziness overcame him. His legs gave way, and he sagged gingerly into a chair at the sabbac table, struck with the fact that the last people to sit here were all dead. He daubed his nose, wincing at the pain, and slowly drummed his fingers on the table. He thought of Mar, of Relin, of Jaden. All were putting their lives in danger. For what? For something bigger than themselves, he decided. For something they believed in. What did Kedron believe in? His drumming fingers waited for an answer. He decided they could wait a long time. He flashed on his last conversation with Mar. His friend had said that helping the Jedi was the right thing. He'd been certain of it. Kedron stopped drumming his fingers. He could not always run. Criffin, son of a Murglak, broke my Criffin nose. Okay. He stood, fought down the dizziness, and headed back the way he had come. His wrist throbbed with agony, his nose leaked blood, and felt as if it had been smashed with a hammer. But he was through running. He remembered the way to the lift, but he had a stop to make on the way. Jaden felt lightheaded as the lift sank into the moon. He grounded himself in the force while the hum of the lift's motors proclaimed its rapid descent. By the time it slowed, he figured he had descended 100 meters or more. The doors parted, and the aged mechanism squeaking loud enough to make him wince. Air 10 degrees warmer than that in the surface installation flowed into the lift compartment. It bore the whiff of things dead a long while. He stepped out and into a circular room with an overturned desk and chair near the single door that provided egress. Dried blood, brown and crusted, stained the walls. It was not a spray pattern, Jaden realized. Someone had slathered it on the walls as if it were paint. The shapes and patterns made no sense to him, their meaning plain only to the mad. The lift doors closed behind him. He activated the comlink. "Kedron, do you read?" In the silence, his voice sounded as if he were speaking through a voice amplifier. Water dripped somewhere behind the walls, the rhythm of the distress beacon. The rhythm that of the distress beacon. The comlink exploded in static. "Kedron, do you read?" More static. He was too far underground. He muted the comlink and walked into the room. He realized with horror that he was walking on clumps of hair. Lots of it. Human hair. Brown, black, blonde, gray. It was scattered all over the room like fallen snow. He knelt down and took some in his palm. Ragged pieces of the root clung to the clumps, little brown bits of dried scalp that made Jaden's mouth go dry. The hair had been ripped out in handfuls. Dread settled on Jaden like a funeral shroud. The ceiling suddenly seemed too low, the light too dim, the whole of the complex as oppressive as a tomb. Whatever had happened in the facility had been not merely violent, but macabre. A large brown stain covering the floor near the desk, as if someone had bled out there. Other than the unsettling scattering of hair, he saw no sign of any bodies. Licking his lips, he put his hand on the door control. Not a hatch, but an ordinary door, and it slid open. The stink of old death, a stale, sickly sweet stench, wafted through, stronger than before. He wondered when he would encounter the bodies. He knew it was only a matter of time. A wide curving corridor stretched in either direction. With the angle of the arc, he surmised that the corridor formed a circle and came back on itself. Putting his free hand on his blaster, as tense as a coiled spring, he went left. Blaster marks scored the white Duracrete walls here and there. Blood spattered the walls. Together, the scorches and blood looked like some ancient, indecipherable script, pictographs of violence. Again, he found stray pieces of stormtrooper armor, souvenirs of the slaughter that had occurred. Again, he found no bodies. At intervals, he encountered double doors along the inner wall. All were closed and would have required a card reader to pass, but the readers had been destroyed by either blaster fire or lightsaber. Wanting to understand the layout of the complex, he delayed opening any of the doors until he walked the entire corridor. As he had suspected, it formed a circle. Each pair of double doors stood opposite another pair. Drawing a line between each neatly bisect the circle ringed... What? Drawing a line between each would neatly bisect the circle ringed by the corridor, another example of the Imperial fetish for symmetry. He walked to the nearest set of the metal double doors. In addition to the destroyed card reader, the doors also had a manual lock and bar. The bar, a rod of titanium alloy, lay on the ground near the doors, bent. Whatever was behind those doors, the doctors had not wanted it to get out. But it had gotten out, and it had slaughtered everyone in the facility. Jaden took a handle in hand, conscious of how cool the metal felt in his palm, and pulled it open. A narrow corridor led straight about 10 meters before ending at another metal door. Above it was written, "Observation Deck." Hallways and rooms opened along the corridor's sides, and Jaden noted them in passing. A few offices with chairs and desks overturned, loose flimsies cast over the floor, destroyed computers and data crystals scattered everywhere. A conference room, its chairs toppled, the conference table cut into pieces by a lightsaber. A wall-mounted vid display had a burn hole like a singularity in its exact center. He assumed that there was a laboratory somewhere, but he did not stop to look for it. His feet carried him of their own accord to the door that led to the observation deck. A half-full calf pot sat on the floor in the corner of one office. somehow completely unaffected by the chaos. Calf mugs, too, littered the floor here and there, all of it the ruins of ordinary activity and interaction. His eyes caught an unexpected shape, and he stopped, staring at it. Set atop an overturned desk was a single shoe, a woman's shoe, browned with dried blood and still wrapped in an age-yellowed starry slipper, the kind worn by laboratory techs. The scene struck a visceral chord in Jaden, repulsed him. Someone or something had to have consciously placed the bloody shoe there, as if its presence exactly there were important, as if it were some kind of trophy, as if it made some kind of sense. A realization struck him. He was seeing reified madness. Dr. Gray's head, the hair on the floor, the shoe, all of it, the acts of deranged minds. The clones had gone mad. Perhaps they had been unable to reconcile the two poles of their origin, Jedi and Sith. Perhaps a misstep along the sword edge a Force user walked would lead not to a fall into the dark side so much as a descent into madness. Jaden's mind turned to Kedron, to the stories he'd heard of outbound flights' failure. Master Kaboth had gone mad, and his actions had led to many deaths. Jaden feared he was slipping himself. He felt an abyss to either side, yet he could not stand still. He craved certitude, yearned for it the way a drowning man did air. He unmuted his comlink, and Static shouted at him. "Kedron," he said, knowing it was hopeless, but wanting to say something aloud. A human sound to break the funeral silence of a facility that felt like a crypt. A metallic clang from somewhere ahead caused him to tense. Moving slowly, he muted his comlink again and approached the door that led to the observation deck. He stood before it for a moment, his lightsaber sizzling in his hand, his other hand on his blaster, but the sound did not repeat. He slid the door open, crouching to reduce his silhouette. A large, round chamber opened before him. The lights suspended from the high ceiling had all been shattered, their glass littering the floor like broken ice. So he flashed his glow rod around the room. It had to have been 100 meters in diameter. Waist-high computer console towers rose here and there from the floor like stalagmites, each one an eerie simulacrum of the communications tower that screamed into space for help. He stepped inside, and the feel of the floor immediately struck him oddly. He crouched and shined his glow rod directly at it. It was transparasteel, dimmed the way Junker's cockpit viewport could dim when the ship entered hyperspace. He also noticed a latticework of hair-fine filaments that ran through it, capillaries of unknown purpose. He knelt and looked through the transparasteel. He could just make out the ghosts of shapes in the room below, but nothing distinct. On the far side of the room he saw the dark hole of an open lift shaft, the door only half shut, an eye frozen in the act of closing. He rose and walked to one of the computer consoles. The interface was intuitive and controlled the lighting in the room he was in, as well as the lighting, temperature, and noise in the rooms visible through the floor. He turned on the power to the rooms below, expecting the lights to be non-operational. They functioned, illuminating the equivalent of a fishbowl. He pressed another key to illuminate the dimming effect on the floor. The observation deck overlooked a sub-complex of rooms that Jaden assumed to have been the clones' living quarters. Hallways radiated outward from the central meeting room and attached mess hall. Two Dejeric sets sat atop a table in the meeting room, the static-laden holographic creatures facing each other across the battlefield, the games unfinished. The chairs in both rooms had been pushed neatly under the table. Plates and eating utensils sat in orderly stacks atop the serving counter in the mess. Unlike the rest of the facility, everything in the clones' rooms was in place, tidy, and invariably white, cream, or some shade of gray. "Womp rats in a maze," he murmured. Jaden walked the observation chamber, his steps slow, staring at the rooms below his feet, tracing them as if he were walking in them himself. The hallways led to sparsely furnished personal quarters, 9 of them. Each contained a bed, a desk, 2 chairs, some old books in hard copy. He had not seen an actual book in a long time, and he puzzled over their presence. A single data crystal could hold an entire library of information and take up essentially no space at all, until he remembered Dr. Black's words from the hololog. The doctors had given the clones hard copy books, so they'd have no data pads from which to scrounge parts. In fact, Jaden realized for the first time that there were no computers of any kind in the clones' rooms. They'd managed to construct lightsabers anyway. He continued his walk, noting little assertions of individuality in each of the personal quarters. A potted plant, long dead, a remarkable clay sculpture of a human hand, a shelf on which sat 4 green bottles, their color a contrast with the grays and whites of the complex. He stopped cold when he stood over the last bedroom, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. Words had been written on the ceiling, Jaden's floor. They were in basic and underlined. The jagged letters, the dried brown of old blood. Stop looking at us. Jaden suddenly felt guilty for walking in the footsteps of the doctors. He imagined the clones living in those quarters day in and day out, the feet of the gods who had made them walking across the ceiling. No privacy, no freedom. Small wonder they had grown so hostile. The thick durasteel walls that encased the clones' area might as well have been bars. Despite what they had done to the others in the complex, Jaden pitied them. He walked to the nearest console and powered down the lights. The rooms below went dark. He thought they should stay that way. Somewhere down the lift shaft, a can or metal drum fell, rolled across a hard surface, and rattled itself still. Startled, Jaden flashed his glow rod around the room. The beam pierced the darkness, but illuminated nothing. His fingers warmed as thin tendrils of blue force lightning snaked from his fingertips and swirled around the glow rod. He stilled his mind, fell into the force, and calmed himself. He reminded himself that the clones had been prisoners, victims. He reached out through the force, feeling for another force user nearby, but encountered nothing. "I'm here to help you," he called, his voice echoing around the large room, its own version of the distress beacon. "Help you, help you, help you." No response. He moved to the open doors of the lift, lightsaber at the ready. The control panel had been destroyed. A charnel reek drifted up through the doors. Fumes from some forgotten hell. Shielding his nose with his forearm, he beamed his glow rod down the shaft. It descended perhaps 30 meters. The lift compartment sat at the bottom, its interior visible through a large rectangular hole in its top. He guessed that a lightsaber had cut the hole. He hung over the void for a long while, smelling death, listening to nothing but his own heartbeat. He had to go down. Metal rungs ran the length of the near side of the shaft, but he did not bother with them. Drawing on the force, he picked his spot atop the lift compartment and leapt. The force cushioned his impact, and he hit the top of the lift in a crouch. Without pausing, he lowered himself through the hole in the roof and into the lift proper, lightsaber to hand. The smell of death was stronger. He started to call out again, but thought better of it. His glow rod lit a long, narrow corridor that sloped downward. The air felt humid, moist with putrescence. Long, thick streaks of dried blood stained the duracrete floor. Jaden followed them as he might a trail of breadcrumbs. They led to a wide stairway that dropped another 10 meters. A large metal hatch waited at the bottom of it. He descended sidelong, his back against one wall. A card reader hung from the wall to one side of the door, its wires and circuitry hanging loose like innards. 20 or 30 stormtrooper helmets lay on the floor to either side of the door, stacked into a rough pyramid. Some of them still had heads in them, for Jaden could see dead eyes behind some of the lenses. The scene reminded Jaden of an offering. Stenciled on the wall over the doorway, authorized personnel only beyond this point. Across the hatch, written in an enormous diagonal scrawl of dried blood, were 3 words. Jaden felt chilled when he read them. Mother is hungry. Jaden stared at the hatch a long while, rooted to the last stair. Moving from it seemed a fateful step, a portentous act. Holding his ground, he again reached out through the force, feeling for the presence of any nearby force users. Making contact with almost instantly, he winced at the bitter recoil caused by the touch of a Darksider, but not a pure Darksider. Jaden felt the dark side as though it was adulterated with something else, the same way his own signature was that of a light side user adulterated with something else. Sentience curses us with a desire to categorize. He looked down at his hand as if it were a thing apart from him, a piece of him that had betrayed the rest, and thereby corrupted the whole. Tiny streamers of force lightning curled around the glow rod, twisting like things alive. The regard of the force user on the other side of the hatch fixed on him. The mental touch felt as greasy as the air, just as infected with putrescence. He descended the step and opened the hatch. And cliffhanger. That's the end of the chapter. So we have one last chapter we'll finish on Wednesday. And then I'm not sure where we go from there. I can find out real quick, though. So the next thing to read is going to be one of the Lost Tribe of the Sith books. In fact, it looks like we'll be reading a bunch of them before we get back to any comics or anything. So yeah, we got a bunch of them, and they're all fairly short books. So yeah, but one more chapter, we'll find out how this all comes together, and yeah. So I guess I will do a short Stalker session here in just a little bit. After a short break. So I will be back in 10-15 minutes for another stream. See you then.
Prepare to die. Prepare to die. Welcome to a whole new world. Your planet is now under Mid-Ranger's control. Humanity will be exterminated. If you hear this message, do not try to leave. Do not try to fight. Do not try to resist. You will be eliminated.